Hello and welcome to Parent Talks presented by St. Michael's College School. My name is Lianne Castelino, Director of Marketing and Brand Strategy at the school and your moderator for this event. Parent Talks is an initiative of the Student Affairs Department and Community and Learning Partnerships at St. Michael's. It began in May of 2019, and this is the 7th presentation of Parent Talks. Our focus tonight, supporting your son's safe return to school. We are delighted to present our first all-medical panel to discuss this topic. If you have questions for our panelists, feel free to share them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to your questions throughout the 60 minutes, over the next 60 minutes. Now to our panelists. Dr. Peter Lynn is a family physician with a busy practice in Toronto. He's also the Director of Primary Care Initiatives at the Canadian Heart Research Centre and a two-time contributing author to the Canadian Diabetes Guidelines. Dr. Lynn is also a health columnist for CBC Radio and television, and he's also the father of 2 adult boys. Dr. Abdu Sharkawy is an internal medicine and infectious diseases consultant at University Health Network and based at Toronto Western Hospital. He's also an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Toronto, a regular medical contributor for CTV during the global pandemic, and has conducted interviews with media outlets around the world on the topic. He is a father of 3 boys under the age of 10. Dr. Mark Broussenko is a family physician and a hospitalist at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, in Toronto. He's been the medical lead for Parent Talk since it began in May of 2019. And Dr. Broussenko is also an alumnus of St. Michael's College School, having graduated in 2007. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks very much, Lianne.
Before we begin, a reminder to our audience that the views and opinions expressed in today's panel represent those of our medical guests alone and may not necessarily reflect those of St. Michael's College School. Now, we do have a poll question for you this evening. The question is, are you pleased that schools are slated to reopen this fall? Yes or no? Feel free to participate and we will have the results of that poll question for you later in the program. Now to the questions. First of all, to the medical panel, I'd like to start with what is top of mind for each of you on the topic of a safe return to school as it relates to what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Dr. Sharkawy, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that really what we want to do is prepare ourselves and our families to begin as many safe practices and to maintain them in our daily routine, anticipating what's going to be a stressful time moving forward. Going back to school is going to look a lot different for kids who are not going to be able to socialize as easily as they have been used to doing in the past. The use of masks is something that's going to be a bit of a foreign experience for them. The idea of having to be extremely vigilant about hand washing, these are all things that I think are very important to incorporate into our everyday practice and routine now, and to talk to our children about and make sure that if there are areas that are bringing them anxiety, if it has to do with mask wearing or how they're going to be able to maintain social bonds with their friends and others in the school environment, that we talk through that and try and reduce the amount of anxiety that they have. And at the same time, to model that sort of behavior as well. Kids realize that as adults, we're facing our own sort of stressors as well. We're learning to adjust to things, and we need to make sure that we're modeling very good coping mechanisms, good strategies in terms of how we're preparing ourselves when we reintegrate with a normal routine, whatever that may be.
And we are going to drill down into many of the topics that you covered there. But Dr. Lynn, I'm curious for your top of mind idea that's going through you right now as a family physician as it relates to a safe return to school.
Yeah, right now, it's the uncertainty. I think a lot of parents, students, teachers, they don't actually know the details. So that's where there's a little bit of a gap. And so therefore, the uncertainty causes anxiety and everything else to increase. I guess one of the things that we had talked about way back at the very beginning was that this virus cannot move on its own, right? It's actually a very weak organism. If you think about it, it has no wings and it's no feet. So it can't actually move unless we help it. So either we're breathing it out or we put it on our hands and we bring it up to our face. And the only way that it can replicate is within us. So it doesn't even have its own photocopy system. So it can't move. It doesn't have its own photocopy system. And so if we kind of drill down onto that, then it makes sense why these simple things work. You know, the social distancing, the mask, and washing your hands. It sounds kind of very primitive, but those are the things that work because this virus really can't do a whole lot. I mean, if I were to tell people this is a USB stick, basically the virus is a USB stick. It has a bit of information on it. It can't move, it can't do anything, and it needs a computer to copy itself. And if I said this USB stick is going to take over the world, I think everybody would laugh at me. But here's a virus where we're helping it along. We're helping it move. We're helping it replicate. And so therefore, if we just do these simple steps, it might give us that sense of control again, so that the uncertainty, even though we might not know the details, but we know what we can do to stop it from moving from one person to another.
Dr. Broussenko, from a mental health perspective?
So I think one of the biggest challenges about this entire pandemic and about future planning in general is that we haven't, as a society, quite normalized the reality that this is going to be hard. And it's going to be hard for your kids. It's going to be hard for you. It's hard for us as a medical profession. We're dealing with a lot of things that we haven't ever had to deal with before, at least certainly not at this scale. And accepting that there's going to be difficulties and there's going to be struggles, and that even with the best intentions, we're not going to be able to make it so that everyone is 100% safe and 100% protected, I think weighs on a lot of people. And it's my suggestion to normalize it, especially to your kids, that this is going to be an adjustment, right? This is going to be different than school looked like last year. You're going to have to do some things differently. You're going to lose out on some of the things that you would have been doing otherwise, and that's okay. And it's okay to be frustrated about that. It's okay for that to cause you anxiety, and it's okay for you to come and say, this is a difficult time. And this is not the same. This is not the thing that I see in movies that show me what my teenage experience is supposed to be. Right? These aren't the parties of 2019. And so when we started ParenTalks, we were having conversations about a completely different perspective and a completely different set of issues, and just the amount of change that's happened in the last year. And I hate to use this. It's a cliche from automotive slogans, but these really are unprecedented times, and it's okay to be. It's okay for those times and those experiences to feel overwhelming for people.
On that note, let's talk about how to help parents and support them in terms of, is there an overarching tip that you could share for how parents can support their child's return to school, Dr. Sharkawy?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think that we have to look at the public health recommendations that have been put forth and have been, reiterated repeatedly through this pandemic, and try and not view them as impositions on our lifestyles and our routines, but rather to look at them as means of empowerment, as means of arming us against all kinds of things, including the impending flu season. And that's one of the benefits of some of what we're doing right now, is that whatever we're doing to keep ourselves safe from COVID-19 is actually going to serve us very, very well in protecting ourselves from the flu, which ravages much of our community through much of the winter months. So I think we need to change the narrative from one in which we're seeing ourselves as making sacrifices and doing things that are seemingly unusual and almost obsessive in nature, to making them things that are going to make us healthier. Hand washing makes us healthier, reduces the risk of all kinds of transmissible diseases, respiratory and otherwise. And if we can incorporate that into our routine, especially with younger children's, and make it a challenge that is fun, I think that's helpful. For older children, if we're talking about masks, for example, we can try and make it a fashion conscious mask for them, and something that helps them accentuate their personality and their style, for example. And distancing, we can talk about creative ways in which we can, communicate with each other without necessarily being in close range and putting ourselves at risk. And, kids are very savvy. Kids are very resilient, and they're very, very, I think, amenable and adaptable to change. We probably don't give them as much credit as we should. Anyone knows a kid who's been blocked from one computer program will find a way through it that you never even imagined if you're a parent. I think they own that same sort of resilience. What we need to do is foster the right attitude and the right energy around how we are changing that narrative for them so that they're seeing it in a more positive light. And I think if we can do that, it becomes a much less daunting experience to take all these simple steps to avoid the wings and feet that Dr. Lynn spoke about so perfectly. Yeah.
So building on that, Dr. Lynn, what can you suggest to parents that they can prepare their children to do now as they look at return to school in a couple of weeks?
So there's 2 weeks left. And so the idea is, it's kind of like, you know how you prepare your child for driving, right? So the government and everybody puts certain rules like speed limits and bumps and things like that. They make the car a little bit safer. They got airbags and stuff like that. But in the end, we need to train our children to drive safely. In other words, we teach them and we drill into them. You have to wear your seatbelt. You have to do this. You have to do this. So in a strange way, this is the same thing, is that we need to prepare them. So in other words, the schools will do what they can. But in the end, your child will be making decisions every single day. Where do they sit? How do they eat lunch? Where they're on the bus. How are they going to do that? So really what we should do is over the next 2 weeks, that's our homework, is to think about the process of how to get the child to school. So is it a bus that they have to go on? So on the bus, let's think it through. How do we make sure that the busing is safe? And then when we get there, what do we do? There's a bunch of people in the way of the door. How do you handle that? So it's almost like giving them scenarios that you help them work through. So that way, when they come up to that scenario, they're not sitting there going, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of people in front of the washroom. What do I do? You know? So these are the kinds of things that perhaps we should work on now, just like you're preparing your child to go driving, or when my kids were young, you know, don't talk to strangers, don't take candy from them, don't let them put a tattoo on you, don't get into a white van, you know, where they push you in, you know, those kinds of things that we drilled into our kids. And there's no difference here. The problem is there was a sense that we need the school system to fix everything. In other words, we need the desks to be put separate apart and so on and so forth. And that's true. Just like we need speed limits, we need bumper guards, we need seat belts and those kinds of things. But then the rest of it is up to us to train them. And the more practice they get, it's kind of like the NBA players. They practice, practice, practice. And when they get the ball and they're in this position, they know exactly what to do because they've practiced so many times. And so perhaps we could do that over the next 2 weeks. And that way we feel comfortable that your child knows everything and your child feels comfortable as they're going into this a little bit unfamiliar situation, but they'll know what to do in different scenarios.
Dr. Broussenko, from a social emotional health perspective, we're talking about an age group here of between 12 and 17 years old, if we're talking about St. Michael's College School students. What can parents be doing to prepare them from that perspective?
So I think just to echo some of the major message, I think, from Dr. Sharkawy is that we need to change the energy around this. But we also need to change some of the groundwork and some of the rules to make it so that kids don't feel like this is punishment, right? So these are not punitive measures, they're protective measures. So these aren't things that you are in trouble for if you fail. These are things to aspire to do well so that you can protect your community. And I think that's, you know, oh, you didn't wash your hands properly, or oh, you were talking to so-and-so and you weren't appropriately socially distanced, like you're a bad child, is I think the wrong way to go about this. Because then this feels like a punitive imposition, and it feels like a disruption to large parts of normal adolescent development. It feels like something has been taken, right? And in practice, it largely, I mean, it has. This has changed so many people's lives, and this has affected so many communities, and the effects will be long lasting. But our success and failure in the moment isn't going to focus on reclaiming what's been taken. It's going to focus on becoming better as a society, about learning how to wash our hands, about learning to stay home if you're sick, about learning how to, appropriately balance risk, and how to make sure that you do your own civic duty not to endanger other people. And arguably, we should have been doing all of these things before. We should have been washing our hands and not picking up a bunch of things in the grocery store before. We should have been staying home when we were sick, even with the flu, even with other respiratory viruses. COVID has changed a lot of things, but it's also reminded us of the things that we were doing wrong previously that we have an opportunity to learn from now. And if we frame it as a perspective of learning and growth, it becomes much less punitive and it becomes much more empowering. That way you can strive towards excellence as opposed to necessarily being punished for failure.
That's definitely a very interesting way to look at it, for sure. Dr. Sharkawy, father of 3 under the age of 10, you might be able to relate to this question that we received from parents prior to this broadcast. How do you go about teaching a teenage boy in a global pandemic how to behave responsibly when they're at school and surrounded by their friends, that they haven't seen many of them in months? Any advice around that?
Yeah, I mean, luckily my kids aren't teenagers yet, but some of them feel like they are. Um, Again, it comes down to really being able to connect with your child, to understand them in a non-judgmental way. We're all social beings, but kids who are going through those adolescent years are really trying to establish their social identities and their growth patterns. And this has been enormously disruptive to them. And I think that we need to be very accepting of the fact that this is going to take a lot of patience, and a lot of humility as parents to be able to work through. So, you have to earn the trust of your child to be able to understand what it is about those interactions that is making them very, very anxious, to help guide them through ways in which they can still retain social bonds with their friends. And as Dr. Broussenko was saying, I think to be very forgiving of the idea when they think they may have lapsed or they may not have been completely aware of something that they were doing. Not to be harsh in your judgment or reproachful, but instead, just to remind and to reinforce good behavior, more than anything else. And I think it's going to take a lot of failures before we see some of the success. I think we're going to see a big period of angst with our kids where they're going to go back to their old patterns because that was the natural way of interacting with their friends, is not maintaining distances, not having a barrier in front of their mouth all of the time. And it's okay as long as the reminders are happening frequently, they're happening in a positive light. And, we're inching towards, as Dr. Broussenko says, aspiration of excellence rather than avoiding the punitive, consequences of failure. I think that is just such an important narrative to continue to try and share with our kids. And I think the kids will respond to that. They're looking to us as parents, as role models and as almost the canaries in the mine. If we can handle it, surely they'll be able to handle it better. And if we're not doing a very good job validating our own feelings and theirs, we can't expect them to succeed.
The other thing that I would add to that is not to make it too complicated. Sometimes we make it so complicated that the kids are looking at you going like, okay, what do I do first? How do I do this? So if we can keep it fairly simple, like we have the 10 commandments and then you kind of boil it down, love your neighbor, that kind of thing, right? So in other words, can we boil it down to something fairly straightforward? And number two, now this is the part that's a little difficult. In the beginning, we said stay away from sick people because sick people are coughing and sneezing and it's the droplets that come out. And so the problem is that we stayed away from sick people. And so that's why when young people got together, they said there was nobody sick at this party. So therefore we thought that everybody was good and then they got COVID or whatever. So we started hearing stories like that. And so now we're aware of this asymptomatic person, which means they don't have symptoms. They're not coughing. They're not spewing. South Korea just followed a bunch of these people 3 weeks. They don't develop symptoms. So in other words, there are truly people have no symptoms at all, but they're still producing the virus. And they produce the same amount of virus as somebody that is coughing. And so the thought is that just because they look well and not coughing or sneezing or whatever, they could still have the virus. Now, that's the toughest thing to explain to an adult, because I think we were all thinking it's sick people. And that's why they asked these people at the provincial parks, why are you guys all together? They go, nobody is sick here. Everybody looked healthy. And of course, there were people that had viruses there. So I think if we can get across the idea that there are people that have no symptoms, but they don't know themselves that they're spewing viruses, they're like a little virus factory. And so that's why we have to take these precautions with everybody. In other words, you don't pick and choose when. Basically, for everybody, you will do this. And then that way, we don't see this big second spike that's coming up that you're seeing around the world, because that's what happens. Virus goes down to very low cases. Everybody says we're good. Virus is gone. And then we can relax. And then as soon as we relax, these people are still around producing. And that's why the second wave tends to be larger, because you have more people that are producing virus factories out there in the second version, right? The first time it was all importing, but this time now there's people situated everywhere. And so now you could pick up the virus. And that's why the second wave becomes a bigger spike. So if we could just do this for people that look well as well, in other words, let's just keep that distance, mask, all that stuff, then hopefully we won't have these cases of asymptomatic transmission going across as well.
Dr. Broussenko, I wanted to ask you and the rest of the panelists as well. It's different because now we're starting the school year, right? As opposed to ending the school year where the relationships were formed, et cetera, et cetera. So what should be considered for those students who will be experiencing a remote learning return to school to start a new academic year versus finishing it off?
So it's an excellent question. I know that when we did our last one of these in May, we were talking about screen time. We were talking about ways for people to stay connected, the impact of social media. And I think, if there's anything that we've kind of seen as a society over the summer is that, and as Dr. Sharkawy mentioned this earlier, like children are inventive, right? Kids, especially teenage boys, tend to already form a lot of their social groups online. They already leverage a lot of the existing technologies and, and avenues that are available to them. And you can form very strong bonds with their peers without necessarily having to interact with them in person. I'm not suggesting that that's the best way to do it, but we don't need to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Right. So if there are opportunities for children to socialize, maybe through some ways that parents were previously a little bit more cautious about, so spending more time digitally, using more social media, connecting more in those ways, I think that actually might be a tool that we have now that we didn't have in previous pandemics that can help maintain social cohesion. That comes with the responsibility that you might need to have conversations about appropriate social media use and boundaries and limits, and children that are younger than you were previously having this conversation. So 12, 13, 14 as opposed to 15, 16, 17. So then that transition age might have changed. But there are lots of resources and there are lots of tools available. And as long as you maybe change some of the perspectives that people were having about screen time and digital connections, then we can actually, we might be able to establish some really good social cohesions, but even for students that have never met each other in person.
It's interesting, as Mark was talking, something came in. You're inspirational to me, Mark, and Dr. Sharkawy, as you were talking about kids being innovative. One of the thoughts that we had way back was talking about the protests, So there were elderly population that wanted to go to the protest, but because they were older, they were at risk of getting COVID. We told them, please don't go. And they felt bad that they weren't part of it. So I had suggested way back sort of naively that whoever's going to the protest should bring, the tablet or the phone, and then the other person is FaceTiming on there. So they can actually be at the protest on the device. So their face is there, they're seeing, they're participating. And as Mark was talking, I said, why can't we do that at the school? So in other words, you have a buddy system. So the one kid that goes into school carries the other kid on a phone. And so therefore, when I put up my hand, it could be for me or for that person. And then therefore, that person is having sort of the experience. And then when they flip over, that same buddy, the one that goes home, is now being carried by his friend. So therefore, the two of them are very tight, so we can build those bonds. And also there's a sense that you're in the classroom, as opposed to watching from a camera from high up, where it's like a out of body experience when you're watching a Zoom room, right? Whereas this one, you would almost be sitting at that desk and you could see. So perhaps something like that might be something that we can entertain, because it sounds like we're going to be in this thing for a little while. So therefore, something innovative like that, and everybody's got a smartphone and they can perhaps use it in this fashion, might be good. And I just had that crazy idea. I'm pretty sure I shouldn't be sharing these things on a forum like this, but perhaps somebody smart listening will say, hey, we could put this together and actually have something useful.
So I want to build on that as it relates to the remote learning environment. Dr. Sharkawy, under what circumstances should a parent consider a remote learning environment exclusively for their child?
Yeah, so I mean, we can talk about it specifically from a health and safety standpoint, and then you can talk about it obviously from a feeling of overall insecurity or a flexibility standpoint in terms of just not wanting to do so. But let's stick to the health aspect first of all. If we're talking about things that put our child or someone within our household at higher risk, you're looking at a child who may have something like poorly controlled asthma, cystic fibrosis, or some other immune compromising condition. That sort of child is probably going to be at very high risk if they acquire COVID-19 of a serious complication. And so they probably shouldn't be in an environment where that is going to be engageable at all. I think it's also important to understand who is within the household. So there are, parents who may be suffering from high-risk conditions, immune compromising conditions, poorly controlled diabetes, or parents or grandparents, for example, in multi-generational households who are over the age of 70. In those environments, I think we want to be very careful about accepting the possibility of introducing COVID-19 into that household. And we have to remember that it's a conduit sort of back and forth between the individual household and the school. And if you are going to accept the risk, you have to remember that it may end up on the other side. So immune compromising conditions and an elderly, member of the household would probably be the main reasons why you should revert to a completely remote learning profile.
Dr. Lin, did you have anything? Oh, go ahead.
So if I can just add to that, I think that approach of considering the household unit collectively is, I think, probably the best way to look at risk stratification and people's personal, safety, safety tolerance and risk tolerance. But I also think that one of the, and I cheated, I looked at some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. So one of the things that I think parents are wondering is, what can we do to help engage and, help our children get buy-in into these decisions? And I think having a collective conversation about this, where you sit down and you talk about, grandma has asthma and your, little sister Sally has, cystic fibrosis, and that's why we think this needs to happen. How do you feel about it? I think making it a collective family decision as opposed to kind of decision by fiat, like you're not going to school, you're not allowed to do this. Both, I think, emphasizes the gravity of the situation and also makes it so that the child, especially if they're younger, feels more involved in the decision making. And if you are going to go down that route, I'd strongly recommend that this becomes a family conversation and a joint decision as opposed to something that is just arbitrarily decided behind closed doors.
Yeah, the other thing along that line also is if there's another family that needs to bubble at home for some reason, then we can put those two families together because both of them are going to be very responsible and so on and so forth. That was the whole concept of this expanding your bubble, is that you are going to pick people that are responsible, that their actions, where they go, their exposure risk. So therefore, if we do have some students that have to stay at home because of medical reasons, can we bubble some of those people together? So that at least they get some contact. So let's say 2 kids get bubbled together so that they're not as lonely. So therefore, it doesn't feel like I'm the one that has to sit here, whereas they can actually have a bit of interaction. And I've noticed some of the parents, because of their frustration in the public system, I've noticed a lot of them have been collecting together and saying, look, we all go to the same school. We're all afraid of the school. So therefore, they bubble together to do something sort of so they have physical interaction, but they can also, even if you're 3 kids together watching the Zoom, it's better than 1 kid watching the Zoom, for example. So something like that might be a little bit creative way of dealing with that isolation part of it.
I think I just want to add a point to that, though, Peter. The whole concept of bubbles at this point in time is kind of going to become artificial in nature. I mean, truthfully, the boundaries were already a little bit blurry to begin with. And, when we start to re-engage a school year, despite our best efforts at cohorting, the bubble is kind of going to evaporate. And I sort of call it the bubble bath. It's no longer just a bubble, it's a whole bunch of bubbles coalescing together, which I think really reinforces the importance of doing things like distancing and hand washing and knowing how to use masks appropriately and not fearing the use of masks, because quite frankly, maintaining the boundaries between individual bubbles is going to be next to impossible.
Yeah, that bubbling that I was talking about would only be for kids that are not going into the school system. You're absolutely right. When the public health system is saying, like, for example, the bubble for a kid is going to be 60 kids. You know, that's a massive bubble, you know, and people are saying, okay, so I was at 10 and now you've grown it to 60. However, if you are somebody that has to stay home, then can we bubble you with one other family that is also medically at risk? So therefore, we know that both families will do their very best to make sure that nobody gets infected, and perhaps those kids can bubble together in that sense. And that way, both sides feel comfortable that they're both going to be responsible and not allow the virus to come in.
You're talking about a double bubble.
Double bubble, yeah.
Rather than bubble trouble, we want to be careful to make the distinction.
So what we're talking about really has to do a lot with the next question that I would like to ask you, and that is daily screening practices that really are going to become commonplace or have to become commonplace in many families. What should they entail, in your opinion, Dr. Sharkawy?
So this is going to be really challenging. I mean, the big problem with COVID-19, as many of us have become aware, is that it has many, many faces, or it is entirely faceless. So the problem is it's not necessarily the typical fever and the cough and the sore throat and the chest pain and shortness of breath and flu-like symptoms. We know that up to 40% of people will exhibit none of these symptoms before they become ill, or will exhibit none at all for, as Dr. Lynn said, for 3 weeks potentially. So I think we have to be careful between striking a balance between going through a set of symptoms and asking if you're feeling X, Y, and Z, and actually being just more vigilant and aware of the possibility that you may not be showing anything whatsoever. But I want to add a caveat to that. I think a lot of people are fearful of the possibility that they could say, well, anything under the sun could be COVID-19. And I want to caution against getting a little too over anxious and overwhelmed by this. And I'll give you the example. Some people have very, very telltale seasonal allergies, for example, hay fever, pollen, something else. I'm sure Dr. Lynn sees much more of this in his practice than I do. I think we want to be careful not to assume that absolutely every symptom is potentially COVID-19. If you know that it's your characteristic time, you're getting itchy, burning, watery eyes, you know, and you're rubbing your eyes frequently, and that's what your typical seasonal allergy pattern is, it's probably your seasonal allergy pattern and not COVID-19. And we don't want everybody to be paralyzed with fear, you know, when you're not feeling 100% regardless of the reason. So I think we want to temper a little bit of our concern and our vigilance with a little bit of common sense.
Dr. Lynn, did you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, I think the one thing though is if your child does have any flu-like symptoms, this is not the time to send them into school. Because I've done that before, right? Where you say, oh, little Johnny's a little sick, but I don't want to take the day off, so send him into school. Because if you send the child into school and if there is a COVID situation, then that area has to be sort of quarantined and people have to go to that 14-day business, in which case you'll be taking a lot of time off work. So I'm hoping that the parents see that, and I'm hoping the employers see that, that if the parent needs to take time off because their child is sick, that they shouldn't be punished, because otherwise a lot of people will say, well, we'll just send him in. He's got the runny nose, but anyway, we'll just send him in anyway. So that time is not right now. So that one we have to be careful of. And then the school system is telling you should screen your child every single day for symptoms. And so, you know, I mean, you know your child as well. So therefore, I think that's useful. And I think if everybody does that and keeps their sick child out of the system, that's very helpful. And then finally, just remember the virus is exactly the same. It's the same virus, but the way your body responds to it is why the symptoms become kind of different, right? So some people, nothing. Some people mild symptoms, some people very severe symptoms, and then some people have an overdrive. So you've heard about this multi-system inflammatory syndrome. It's almost like the army has been turned off, the virus is gone, but the army is still on. It's still at war. And so therefore you have this inflammatory situation. So it's not that the virus is changing, it's just the way we're built is a little bit different. For example, I go out in the sun, I get sunburned, my friend doesn't get sunburned, you know. It's the same sun. So that's the way I want you to look at it. So it's not like the virus is mutating or changing or becoming different. It's just different people. Unfortunately, when you have millions of people getting it, they're going to respond differently to this. Just like if I give penicillin to 1 million people, I will find a few that are allergic to penicillin, for example, right? So, but the problem is we don't know exactly how your child is built and how you're built. So that's why the best thing to do is to avoid getting it, right? Because a lot of people in the beginning said, well, young kids don't get too much. They're just going to have mild symptoms and they'll be good. We know that's not true anymore. And so that's the only thing. It's just, that's why avoiding getting it is so important versus more cavalier version like we're seeing in the stateside.
I'd like to pivot to a question that many of our parents actually sent in to us, and that has to do with public transit. So many of the students at St. Michael's take public transit to come to school. What additional safety protocols and practices should they be looking at above and beyond wearing face masks and physical distancing? Dr. Sharkawy?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that those are obviously the two most important things that can be done. Another one is just trying to improve, airflow. So if you're in a situation where you can open a window, definitely as many windows should be open as possible. We're going to reach a point, sometime in October or November where that's not really permissible without, extreme discomfort. But airflow is another really important thing to minimize the degree of stagnant air that may contain a virus if it happens to be due to an infected person on board any vehicle.
Can I just to add to that, I think one of the big themes that I think we should really emphasize is routine precautions is something that as healthcare workers, it's, that's been drilled into us. You do it without thinking. But consistent routine precautions I'll use a sports analogy because, teenage boys love sports analogies, right? This is like learning the fundamentals of any sport. It's like dribbling a basketball. It's like being able to, stick handle a puck or whatever. You need to do this consistently in almost all situations to be able to play the sport. It's one of the first things you learn. It's the same thing about, social distancing, wearing masks, and hand hygiene, right? If we can get kids consistently wearing masks properly, so, covering their nose and their mouth, not just around their chin, like you see so often, if you can get them consistently washing their hands the way that they're supposed to, not just throwing some soap and water on it and walking away from it. If you can get them to consistently be mindful of the distance that they are from other people, those routine precautions, as they develop into skills that become habitual, will be the most protective thing, as opposed to any sort of superseding Herculean efforts. And then the good thing is those are things that we should have already been doing. Right? We should have already been washing our hands consistently. We should have already not been going to work when we were sick. We should have already been keeping our kids at home when they had flu-like symptoms.
Yeah, by the way, about the hand washing, just to let you know, soap is very good. So the fatty layer side, the fatty end of the soap molecule sticks itself into the virus ball and it disrupts the virus ball. So that's why soap is actually your first choice. And the hand sanitizers is a second choice if you can't get to soap. And for the kids, if you can go earlier in terms of less traffic on the bus, I think that would be helpful. And if there's a chance to carpool, then your bubble is smaller. In other words, the number of people that you're exposed to is smaller. And perhaps you might have never thought about carpooling with another parent, but now maybe everybody's a little bit more excited about carpooling together. And then for your child going onto the bus, mask and shield would be nice. And then head towards the emptier part of the bus. So as the bus gets busy or the subway gets busy, head towards the sections that are a bit emptier. Try to face away from people. And then this one is no proof about this. And I know it sounds silly, but slow down your breathing. Because remember, you have to suck in the virus. Okay, so in other words, the virus cannot go in. It doesn't go in through your skin or anything like that. You actually have to breathe it in. So therefore, if you have mask and shield, the sucking in is actually very hard because the airflow has to go underneath your mask or your shield, and then it has to get through your mask. So if you slow down your breathing, like as if they're practicing for some sort of Tai Chi move, then your sucking power is lower. You'll still get the amount of airflow because you're breathing over a longer period of time. So they're not going to suffocate, but what's going to happen is that the flow that's coming in is going to be lower. So then you have to be much closer to a virus to be able to breathe it in towards you. And so if they're athletic, the slow breathing is actually very good for them. Slows down their heart rate, decreases their adrenaline stuff, everything is good. So maybe we could tell them that for Kung Fu specialists and martial arts guys, this is what they do, is they spend all this time slowing down their breathing. And that might be something that they could practice, which will then decrease their risk of inhaling the virus while they're in a public system.
Just a couple points to add to that, if I could. That's really great point that you brought up there, Peter. And I just want to backtrack to the point about carpooling. Carpooling theoretically has many benefits, obviously, for having a fewer number of kids together. And obviously, if they're part of the same cohort, that's good. I still think it's very important to reinforce that you still need to mask if you're carpooling. And ideally, you should open the windows because you clearly cannot distance if you're carpooling. So you want as many windows open, maximize that airflow if you can. The other thing that's great about the breathing technique that was just mentioned is the fact that it lessens anxiety. So it makes it more manageable to get used to wearing a mask for a lengthy period of time. And so that sort of sense of, subjective claustrophobia or suffocation that people occasionally are overcome with, that can really be diminished if you've learned how to actually ground your breathing and make it a lot more relaxed. And you may be just in general more relaxed as a result of that. So really great tip there.
How about crowded spaces, elevators, where you don't have that physical distancing possibility, Dr. Lynn?
Yeah, so again, not proven, but I've been telling my patients who do live in high rises and things like that, and so they're getting in. A lot of times they're limiting like 2 people, 3 people inside there, but sometimes you're going to be in tight spaces. The students walking out of the washroom, for example, there were situations where there's a hallway and then now you have people very close to each other. And I actually saw somebody kind of panic, when they saw another person down the corridor and they didn't know what to do. So this sounds really kind of ludicrous, but just hold your breath as you're passing the other person. So if you hold your breath, at that moment, there's no airflow coming in at all. So therefore, the chance of you sucking in a virus has been diminished. So if you are in a closed situation for a few seconds, you can hold your breath for a couple of seconds until you get out of that situation. And during the time when we were starting to expand our bubble, we had a lot of elderly grandparents that wanted to get a hug from their grandkids and so on and so forth. And they were nervous about it. And so I said, so when your grandson or granddaughter comes in, for the last 5 seconds, just hold your breath. And then when they come in and their head is over you, they're breathing back there, you can breathe again. And as they pull away, hold your breath for 5 seconds. And then that way you're not crossing. So I can't show you a study like this, but it's just so simple for people to do so that we don't move that virus into your system. So for your sons, basically, you could do the same thing. If they're in a tight situation for a couple of seconds, hold their breath, and then until they get out of it. What we're teaching now our residents in terms of examining a patient, we first of all take a history from 6 feet away, so we don't get in close until we need to. So let's say I need to look in your eye, I have to be pretty close to you. We'll be masked and shields, but then the thing is that to do an eye exam, I can't have the shield on. So now I don't have a shield and I'm doing the eye exam. And so I tell my patient, I'm gonna hold my breath for 5 seconds, you're gonna hold your breath for 5 seconds. So during that 5 seconds, the virus cannot move around at all in that space. So then I can't pass it to you, you can't pass it to me. And so for that 5 seconds, we both hold our breath and then I back away. And then that's just a simple thing that I've sort of discussed with some people. And it doesn't cost anything. I will never prove it because I can't do a study where half the people hold their breath and half don't. But if it works for you, then it just makes the child feel like they're in control in any situation, even in a tight situation like in a hallway where they have to pass each other.
I want to talk very quickly about the flu vaccine this year. So there's parts of the world that currently are experiencing a decrease in the number of flu cases, influenza cases. Is the flu vaccine more important or less important this year, Dr. Sharkawy?
Well, I'm obviously biased on this topic. For me, the flu vaccine is always important, and it's definitely more important this year because we've got the possibility of a double whammy on our hands. Every year, flus cost, an enormous amount of absenteeism, lost productivity, never mind loss of life in vulnerable members of our families and our communities. So we certainly don't want an added risk on top of that with a faceless and difficult to identify virus like COVID-19. The great news is we've seen some really encouraging results from Australia. Australia's winter mirrors our summer and vice versa. So Australia's flu season is effectively over at this point, and it was actually one of the most historically, more favorable flu seasons, in recent memory. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the case. It's because of the measures that were taken with respect to distancing and hand hygiene and masking. People were not closely clustered together. They weren't sharing this virus and shedding it either, knowingly or not. And I think that bodes very well for us, that these very, very simple things that, again, as Mark said, we should have been doing well before we had 20+ million reminders around the world, are now, very obvious for us. That should be something that should be very empowering. We can look forward to the possibility of avoiding 2 potentially very, very serious conditions by applying the same set of rules. We don't have to learn a different playbook here for the flu season. We just keep applying the same practices we've been doing now, and it'll serve us really well.
If I can just add to that, I mean, there is an approved treatment for the flu. There is a vaccine for the flu. I don't think anyone, despite the fact that there was some skepticism about whether or not COVID-19 was a real thing when it first started, no one denied that the flu existed, and yet still every year thousands of Canadians die from the flu, right? So the idea that somehow the flu vaccine would be any less important this year is, I think, is to me preposterous, right? There are some conversations about when you should time the flu vaccine. So you should get it earlier in the fall or later in the fall, because the immunity eventually wears off. And if you're particularly vulnerable, you want to be protected for the peak of flu season. There are some technical considerations around that part. But absolutely, one of the best things that you can do, if you weren't already doing it as a family, for your safety and for the safety of your children and for the safety of everyone else, is to just get vaccinated. You can get it. It's available now through a number of community pharmacies. You don't even need to go see your family doctor, your pediatrician to get it. It's it's extremely safe. It's extremely well tested. And as I tell all of my patients, there's no guarantee that just because you don't have COVID, that you also don't have something else. And there's also no guarantee that just because you got COVID, you also won't get another superimposed infection on top of that. Right? There's nothing that says that you can't have both COVID-19 and influenza A or B.
And there are some researchers that are looking back at people that have had vaccinations for flu and pneumonia and those types of things. And it seems like the people that got vaccinated they do better with the COVID. So either not as severe disease and so on and so forth. So there's some thought that, is it because there's some boosting of your immune system? And as some of you might have been reading, that the BCG shot, which we used to use to sort of immunize you against tuberculosis, they noticed that in countries that have that as mandatory, everybody gets a BCG shot, that in those countries, the number of cases were lower and the number of deaths were lower as well. And BCG boosts your immune system. We actually use it to treat certain bladder cancers and things like that. So it boosts your immune system. So the thought is that some of these vaccines may be doing that. So it's pushing your immune system upward. And so therefore they're a little bit better off in terms of responding. So that's early stuff. They're looking backwards, but at least if you're sort of on the fence about the flu shot, this might be the thing that would push you over to saying, yes, I'm going to go ahead and get it.
And I'll just add to that, like a lot of people have talked about herd immunity throughout this entire pandemic. And, it's interesting that people talk about herd immunity as a sort of spontaneous way in which the entire community can be protected, while negating the real possibility that something that you can actively do with a vaccine will protect others around you. So it speaks to this important concept of accountability. It applies both to the flu and to COVID-19. It's a responsibility we each have to try and prevent ourselves from unknowingly being the vehicle of something that's going to endanger the health of someone we love or care about, or someone else who's equally vulnerable.
We only have about 12 minutes left. This hour is going by very fast here, but I did want to cover some very important topics that have been alluded to that are on many people's minds. Dr. Sharkawy, could you take us through face masks, face shields, the fabrics, the type of fit that is optimal to kind of clear that up for us?
Yeah, so the great thing about the concept of face masks is that there's a lot of different options that will work and will be relatively effective for routine non-medical use, particularly for employing proper practices with respect to distancing and hand hygiene as well. So you can use a fabric that is relatively comfortable. A cotton material is usually fairly safe. There are different sort of more heavily stitched fabrics that are made that are impregnated with the same sort of material used to make hypoallergenic pillows. The great thing is there's no lack of manufacturers out there for masks of all styles. But what are important things to ensure that your mask is safe and that it's actually working properly? Number one is it should fit properly, which means that if you're wearing a pair of glasses, for example, and it's a test that you can use, if you are breathing and your glasses are fogging up rather instantly, it means you don't have a well-fitted mask, and it's probably not something you should use. A lot of masks are fashioned with a wire loop that goes over the bridge of the nose. That's meant to be pinched down so that it goes right over your cheekbones and provides a seal there so that air is not going up in towards your eyes as well. And it should come underneath your chin and wrap around tightly. It's not quite as important to be perfectly sealed around the sides of your face, but if you can, that's also optimal to reduce the airflow. A simple test that you can use to try and make sure that your mask is actually protective is what you should do is light a candle. And you should stand about a foot away from that candle, okay, and blow and try and blow it out. And if you can do that, your mask is probably not good enough. And the fabric that it's made out of is not protective enough if you have COVID-19 not to spread it to somebody else. Similarly, some of these masks are thin enough, the ones that are made by some of the, fashion conscious Nikes and Under Armours and other, sports fashion designers, they look good, but if you put your hand up about a half a foot in front of your face and breathe, you can feel that hot air on your hand. That mask isn't doing enough to protect others around you. So those are simple things that you can do. There's also ways to augment the safety of your mask. So if your mask is thin, you can put a coffee filter inside of it. Now, bear in mind that that's going to come at the expense of some of your comfort, and it may not feel perfectly well, but it will provide an extra layer and an extra barrier of protection. You can use a paper towel if you want as well. It's important to know that your mask should always be worn properly. Don't wear it under your nose. Don't wear it like an earring, like a sailor, and don't wear it on your chin, because that's not providing any protection to anyone around you or to yourself. So there's plenty of stuff online. Look around. There's masks with translucent areas around the mouth so that expressions and smiles can be seen. I use one of those masks all the time from the Como Foundation. They make masks for people who are hard of hearing, and I get compliments on it all the time. So there's limitless options really out there. Make it fun, make it part of your personality, make it part of your style, and make it work.
Frequency of hand washing and hand hygiene in a school environment.
Yeah, I think this is one that we probably don't want to necessarily over or undersell. And this should be made as commonsensical and as routinized as possible, which means, hand washing should be done before and after eating. It should be done before and after going to the washroom. And it should be done before and after using anything that's a high touch surface, for example, like a keyboard, or if you're using tools in a shop class or something of that variety, that's when you should be doing it. We don't want to make people paralyzed with fear about hand washing. We know that it's not a major issue in terms of COVID-19 compared to some other viral pathogens, but we also want to make sure that people are just making it a routine habit. So those are the areas that we really want to focus on.
And I guess the key is not to have it before you touch your face. That's the other thing that I tell people, because otherwise you touch a doorknob and you say, that's high traffic, I got to go wash my hands, right? So the key is the virus can't get through your skin, but it needs to be brought up to your nose, and then you can breathe it in. So the virus can't move, so you have to move it up there. So that's why you tell the children is that before you touch your mask or touch your face, then you got to wash your hands. So that way they can go about doing your thing. And then when they're about to eat their lunch, they're going, oh, I'm going to go and remove my mask. I got to wash my hands. So then they cut it down to one-time washing as opposed to 50 times washing during the day. So I think what happened was that wash your hands a lot, but we forgot to tell people it's when your hands comes near your face. That's really the important one, that you have to wash your hands. And then for the face mask, I totally agree. There's so many different versions. I would just add that have material that doesn't suck in. So the problem with when people feel they're suffocating is when the material sucks in and then it sticks to your face. then it's hard to breathe, right? So have material that's either got the pleats or a little bit more rigid, or they have that sewing down the middle. So you have sort of like a little beak almost. And that way the material doesn't suck in on you when you breathe. And the whole goal is two things. One is to stop you from sending virus out. So as Dr. Sharkawy said, it's not going to be perfect, like we're not going to be sealed, but at least we could stop it from going 2 feet out. So maybe it'll only go 3 inches out. So now somebody's got to be really close. But I know what a lot of parents said and a lot of Americans said, my child is not sick. So therefore, now he's got to wear a mask to protect other people, but he doesn't have a disease. So why are we wearing the mask? So now I flip it around. If the material is slowing down your blowing out, it's also slowing down your sucking in. So the speed at which you can suck in is slower. So therefore, you need to be closer to the virus particle to breathe it in. So the mask actually protects your child from breathing it in as well. You have to be much closer to the virus before you can coax it to come into your lungs. And so that's why the mask is helpful. And that's also why the shield is very helpful. The shield is leaky everywhere. There's no seal anywhere, but the reason why it works, it stops me from blowing it directly at you. So the virus goes downward if I have it, and it stops me from inhaling the virus because the virus has to go down and around and then get into my mouth. And so that's why either a mask or a shield will work. So if your child doesn't like the mask, it finds it too claustrophobic, then a shield would be helpful. For teachers, we've been asking them to do mask and shield if you're near a child, helping them close up. And if they're teaching, they can just use the shield because they're far away. And some of the teachers were saying they can't yell through the shield. So I saw some very creative people with these little wireless microphones hooked up to a speaker. And so they can talk and then the kids can hear. And it was actually quite good. So the shield would be helpful. So
Dr. Lynn, sorry, I was just going to say in the same vein, footwear and knapsacks for students.
Yeah, so when they swab floors in hospitals, 100% of the swabs came back with virus from the floor. So therefore, the bottom of your shoes and backpacks that go down on the floor. So shoes that come into the house stay by the door. So don't let your kids run around the house because now you've tracked virus elsewhere. And the backpack should not go onto a table or a bed because those are places where your hands can touch and your face might go down. So the bottom of a backpack is actually quite nasty. So keep that on the floor as well. And that'll just cut it down. It's not a big way to transmit, but it carries all sorts of other things as well. So probably it's a good idea just to get into the habit of leaving those things on the floor.
What kind of hygiene is required when students return home from school, would you say?
Yeah, this is interesting. So for doctors, because they're working around people, what they then do is decontaminate, right? So change your clothes, wash your hair, do everything. And that way, the rest of the family feels better. I'm not sure if it actually helps, but it certainly makes everybody else feel better. If your child is at school and let's say they come home, maybe we should get into that habit, right? Change into different clothing and then take a shower because your hair might have stuff on it. And then that way you're comfortable that you haven't brought any virus home. And it's not excessive, right? Like we're not telling them to scrub down or use all sorts of Clorox or anything like that. Just a simple shower with soap would be enough if you want to go that far, especially if they've come in from public transit. Then I would say that that's probably still a good idea.
Dr. Broussenko, we only have about a couple of minutes left, but I did want to ask you, in terms of managing the normal stress and anxiety that comes along with starting a new school year for students, now we're having to deal with a pandemic. What just general tips can you offer parents to support their sons?
So one of, I think, the big, the most important takeaways from all of this is to remember that, COVID-19 is disruptive to society, and it's the new kid on the block. But the most dangerous things for your children are not this virus, right? So it's all of the other leading causes of mortality and morbidity in the teenage boy population. Doesn't mean that you don't have to take it seriously. It just means that you should remember that you should still be having conversations about substance use. You should be having conversations about safe driving. You should be having conversations about healthy relationships. You should still be doing all of those things as opposed to kind of the easy tunnel vision that comes with looking at everything through a COVID lens, right? Because I think it's very easy to forget to focus on, the fact that you still have a 16-year-old child that's driving a car for the first time. You still have someone that might be entering into a new relationship and might not have some of the tools required to deal with that. Teenagers will still continue to have parties where they're consuming substances and alcohol, despite all your best efforts to tell them not to. And so, remembering that those are still things that are going to happen, and that those are still things that you should plan for and manage, as opposed to getting sidetracked by looking at everything through, how can we minimize your exposure risk to COVID? I'm not suggesting that you should, it's not either or, you should absolutely do both. But don't let the tunnel vision and the hype around this distract you from all of the other kind of routine stages of parenting.
On that note, we are going to go to our poll question for tonight, which was, are you pleased that schools are slated to reopen this fall? 87% of respondents said yes. So that's a great thing. And only 13% said no. That is our time. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Peter Lynn, Dr. Abdu Sharkawy, and Dr. Mark Broussenko for your incredible feedback and your wonderful perspectives. As you exit this webinar, there is an opportunity to participate in a survey. We value your feedback and invite you to fill it out. The recorded version of this presentation will be available on St. Michael's College School's YouTube channel at SMCS 1852. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.